Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to Hauser Wirth. I'm Russell Salmon, Director of Public Programs here at the Gallery. We're thrilled to have you all here in person and via live stream for this very special conversation with writers Musa Mayer and Adam Gopnik on the occasion of Hauser Wirth Publishers' new edition of Musa's classic book, Night Studio, a Memoir of Philip Guston. Night Studio is both a deeply personal account of growing up in the shadow of a great artist and a daughter's quest to better understand her father. This new edition is complemented by Musa's reflections on the recent reception of Guston's work and the afterlife of her memoir, first published to critical acclaim in 1988. Musa manages the Guston estate and is president of the Guston Foundation, whose legacy project is the creation of philipguston.org. Last year, she also promised her extensive personal collection of her father's work to the Metropolitan Museum of Art for when the new modern and contemporary wing opens at the end of the decade. Adam Gopnik has been writing for The New Yorker since 1986. During his 5 decades at the magazine, he has published more than 1 million words in hundreds of essays, from personal memoirs to reviews and profiles, along with much reporting from abroad, as well as fiction, humor, and art criticism. I think it's fair to say we're in for a treat tonight. So without any further thing to add, please join me in welcoming Musa Mayer and Adam Gopnik.
Thank you. Thank you, and what a wonderful crowd. I feel more like a hockey player at Madison Square Garden I ever have, with this wonderful slanted stadium seating. Anyway, this is the first time I've ever had the opportunity to actually meet Musa Mayer. Mayer.
Thank you.
I will add a little background before we begin our conversation, if I might. I wrote about this book, about Night Studio, when it first came out in 1988. I had been the art critic at The New Yorker for about 2 years at that point. And it was such an extraordinary book and evoked Philip Guston so movingly that it was irresistible. And it was an occasion for me to start the business of appreciating your father's painting, and particularly his late painting. I wrote an essay once called Audubon's Passion, about the beginning of American art and the art of Audubon, that enormous appetite for everythingness, every bird, every beast, and so on. And one of the things that's very moving about that particular history is that Audubon had to go through an incredible inner tempest and moment of transformation when he lost his conventional ambitions and decided to become what in those days was condescended to as an ornithological illustrator. And I always have felt that the great figures of American art almost always have a passion in that almost religious sense, some period they go through where everything gets thrown upside down and they have to make a fundamental, and I'll say it, spiritual decision to go on in the face of resistance and to pursue their own path. And of no one is that more true than of Philip Guston. An artist who always went his own way. This will surprise you, but I can recall the 1962 show of your father's painting at the Guggenheim.
Seriously?
Seriously, I can, believe it or not.
How old were you
I
then?
was 6 years old, and this is only explicable because you have to understand that my parents were crazy. They were genuinely crazy people who had 6 kids and lived in Philadelphia, and they lived for art. My mom wanted to be a painter, painted in a style very much derived from Philip Guston. And so they took us to the Guggenheim to see my sister Allison and myself, to see that show, which I remember to this day. We now live on the same block of it. And at that point, I mentioned that not only out of sheer egomania and narcissism, but because at that time, what's significant about that is that that period in your father's work seemed finished. Philip Guston at that point was the Monet of abstract expressionism, this artist of infinite nuance and optical shimmer who stood for a whole set of values sufficiently to have a mid-career retrospective at the Guggenheim. And then, as I'm sure everyone in this room knows, he went through a passion in the beginning in the early 70s when he gave up what had been his accomplishment, and took an entirely new direction in his own work and for American painting. And said so beautifully and memorably, and having said that, I will now forget the exact words, but you'll remind us that painting is a history of its impurities, and that the search for purity, the kind of Greenbergian search for purity, was a fiction, a falsehood, and all the impurity of life had to come back into painting. And indeed, it did. Famously, was wildly attacked by the art establishment, particularly in the person of a now forgotten art critic named Hilton Kramer. And the asymmetry of the criticized and the critic and the artist is stronger than ever there, in a violent way, and then went on, and this is when I came in 1988, to become perhaps the single most influential body of work in American painting as the 80s went on, part of the revival, not of realism in a narrow sense, but of a certain kind of eclectic personal expression rooted in a certain form of popular culture, in the art of and it's very complicated, and you qualify it beautifully in this book, but in the cartoon, in comics in a certain way. And in fact, just to conclude this preamble, when Kirk Varnado and I did the exhibition High and Low, Modern Art and Popular Culture, we made your father's last paintings into what in musical theater is called the 11 o'clock, the final emotional concluding statement. And since that time, and it was in 1990, his reputation has only gone on. So thank you, Musa, for being here with us. But that's the shape. Was that a fair picture of the shape of Guston's career?
I think so. And your quote about impurities was close enough to the actual quote. I believe it was, art is the adjustment of impurities.
Yes, the adjustment. That's a beautiful word, not the engine.
Right, but it's also true that that sort of landmark show of High and Low opened the door to a whole burgeoning for painters particularly, yes, that really was initiated during the 70s and onward. I don't think my father had any idea what permission he gave to artists to transform themselves.
Permission to artists, to painters particularly, but also, and we'll talk about it, to novelists and poets, to anybody who is contemplating the necessity of making a great and audacious leap. But this book is also, and one of the things that makes it beautiful, and I think has kept it perpetually in print in all these years, is it's a daughter story. You are not invisible in this book at all. It's about the relationship of a father and daughter, and you had a complicated relationship with your father. My favorite story in the book, if I may, is when you talk about the chicken hearts.
Oh gosh, yes.
Tell that story, because it's such a lovely story of father and daughter.
Well, this actually was a dish that my mother cooked for me, and but I'm getting a little ahead of it. Whenever my father would roast a chicken, and he was a wonderful cook, particularly Italian and Chinese, but even normal day to day. So he would roast a chicken, and he would always, strange though this may sound, affectionately pluck the heart on the tip of a fork and feed it to me. And so my mother had the idea that somehow I really loved chicken hearts. And she once prepared chicken hearts a la king for me, which I refused to eat.
And she didn't understand it wasn't the taste of the chicken heart. It was the act of your father.
It was the act of being fed
by your father.
Yeah, absolutely. I basked in his attention. It was only given to me sparingly, I should say, but he had a wonderfully warm personality, and when he turned his attention to you, not just me, but his friends and everybody who knew him well felt this this incredible warmth and enthusiasm that came from him.
And focus, you say, just on the person he was speaking to at that moment.
Absolutely. And what was interesting to them at that time. Yep.
But you then go on to add, and one of the beautiful things about this book is that it's not a bitter memoir in any sense, but it's objective about your father. You then add that people would say, and then he would, once he had done that, he would not cut you off, but lose interest at that moment.
Absolutely, he would. Well, his fear, I think, was always that his obligation to his family, that is to my mother and me, but particularly to me, would somehow take away from what was happening in his studio.
Yes.
And so I was never really included in any way or a part of that. I was outside observing that. And I learned at a very early age to not intrude and to not distract in any way.
That space, his studio space for him was a kind of sacred space, and he had to be there by himself.
He did.
Right. This is familiar to all of us who have loving daughters. I've told my kids that the one rule in life is no bitter memoirs, that they're not allowed. And it turned out they had already, exactly, they already had titles for the memoirs they were planning to write. My daughter, I'd written a book once called Through the Children's Gate, in which she figures as the kind of heroine. And she said, my book is called The Other Side of the Gate.
Right.
And this is a bit of that. Talk a little bit about how you had, what you went through personally to do this, because you had to find out about your father's love affairs, your father's drinking and so on. How did you begin that process?
So I have an editor at Knopf in part to thank for that. I was an MFA student at Columbia in the mid '80s, and
in writing.
In writing, yes,
right. Not painting.
Originally in fiction, and actually my first novel was a thinly disguised fictional version
of this.
Yes, and I was persuaded to actually take on my own story by a really good writer named Joyce Johnson. You may have known her.
Right.
Who wrote this wonderful memoir called Minor Characters. Yes. Joyce had been an early girlfriend of Jack Kerouac and had been a part of that whole beat scene. And she took on the whole subject of something that, as I tried to find my feet as a writer, had never occurred to me, really. This gives you a sense of where I was really at with my father's genius and whatever I considered my gifts were. It never occurred to me that you could actually be a minor character and have a story to tell that anybody was interested in. Right. But I found out eventually, when the book was published, that many people feel like the minor characters in the lives of in the periphery, sort of circling around major figures, be they it doesn't really matter that they were artists. They could be anything.
Could be a politician. You could be Winston Churchill's daughter.
Absolutely. Right. And so in Joyce's class at Columbia, we were asked to write a putative memoir chapter. It was a reading course in memoirs. And so I wrote what became the chapter on openings, about what it had been like for me as a child to go to my father's openings. Yes. And what sense I made of the art world of the early 1950s, and just what it was like to experience from a distance my father's huge anxiety and distress approaching these public disclosures of his work, and then to see the transformation that would then happen, and just as a child trying to make sense of that over the years. long
openings
answer.
were not for your father moments of pleasure and accumulated accomplishment.
No, not really. In fact, it was not only the anxiety of not knowing how the work would be responded to, it was also the sense, I think he felt this maybe most acutely with the Guggenheim retrospective in '62.
Right.
It's like a little death. He
Right.
felt like, my life is over.
Right.
What now? Because he was always exploring, questioning, challenging. He was never, in fact, success was often suspect to him.
Yes.
If he was being praised, there was something niggling at him that maybe that meant that he wasn't really getting
Yes.
to it.
If he was comfortable, if he was comfortable in his position, there was something wrong with his position.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, which is a clue, really, that mindset to why his work kept transforming, which has been the largest mystery, I think, maybe the most common question that I'm asked is, why did he keep changing his work? As if somehow for an artist or any creative person that continuing to do what you've been praised for is what
You ought to
should
be doing.
happen,
Yes.
I've never understood that, but that's because I grew up with that constant doubting and turmoil.
One of the things
from
in the
him.
course of his passion, as I
Yeah.
call it, is he lived in several different worlds,
Yeah.
which you describe here. One of them was that first, the Cedar Tavern world
Yes.
of the abstract expressionists, which you evoke very beautifully. He really was a kind of a latecomer, but in a way, not quite a rabbi, but a yeshiva boy in that
Well,
world.
he always referred to Rothko and Motherwell as the rabbis of,
Yes,
of that group, and de Kooning and Pollock as being the, I
What's the
forget
word?
the word,
Yes,
rabble-rousers or
yes.
whatever. They were
The rednecks,
the
basically.
rednecks,
Of that,
yes.
right.
And I don't know that he ever really found, quote, his place,
Mhm.
or that, he would resist being included with others. He said most famously, what do they think, we're a baseball team? He wasn't a joiner. He wasn't
Right.
someone who liked those kinds of comparisons.
There's a beautiful quote, though, from that period of Mark Rothko's about the difference between himself and Philip Guston.
Oh, yes?
Yes.
It's been a while since I've read the book.
He said, Rothko once said to my father, Philip, you are the best storyteller around, and I am the best organ player.
There you go.
Right.
That's a good one.
And and though it's slightly gnomic, it does seem to be symbolically expressive, that he meant that he was a spiritual, religious chapel artist,
Right.
and that your father's gift, even when he was painting what seemed to be purely abstract pictures, was for a kind of narrative.
Was for narrative. And he ultimately felt, especially as the early 60s progressed, that there was something terribly missing at the heart of abstract art, the enterprise of abstract art. And his own work was evolving. Forms were emerging that reminded everyone, him in particular, of heads, of figures, and so on, as if they were moving through some dissolving mist
Right.
and gradually revealing themselves to him.
One of the things I mentioned in my little preamble that is true about it, of course, he evolved a whole expressive vocabulary, which in lots of ways I've always thought was like Samuel Beckett's. It's on one hand, it's kind of vaudeville and low comedy, but it's
Right.
also full of a particular kind of high despair. And it's the tension between those two things I've always felt structured them. But it's a vocabulary that, at least on the surface, seems to be derived from American comic strips and American cartoons of his childhood, of his youth. But you say in the book that those things were not a passion for him; they were sort of part of his primal unconscious. Is that a fair
As
description?
as a teenager, actually, his first art course after his father's suicide was a cartooning course from the Cleveland School of Cartooning.
Where
I
you
don't
used
know.
to have to just draw the rabbit and then
Yeah,
send
yeah.
it in?
And he started submitting, he was ambitious from boyhood, really. He started submitting cartoons to the LA Times and even won an award or two. Recent scholars have uncovered some of his, and he was a great admirer of Mutt and Jeff. He loved Mutt
Yes,
and
and
Jeff.
that's
And
Bud
particularly
Fisher's
Bud Fisher,
right.
and particularly Crazy Cat.
George Harriman. Yes,
George Harriman. And Harriman, if you look at Harriman's landscapes, you can see Guston's landscapes.
Yes,
I mean, it's really quite striking.
Those absolutely bare horizons.
Yeah,
and
they're desert
upturned,
landscapes.
Yes, transposed to yes, exactly.
Absolutely.
No, I made much hay of that comparison
Yes.
in that time. So you feel that it's fair to talk about this kind of substratum of genuine.
Well, he loved the way that cartoons could tell stories, and he also came to think about that through Renaissance painting. He loved Giotto. I mean, if you think about the famous Giotto chapel near
in Padua,
Padua, you know, that's a series of cartoons. It's a different story, of course. It's not the funnies for newspapers.
Also a Jewish comedy of a kind.
But it is, it absolutely is.
Yes.
And whenever his work, you know, he went through two complete transformations. The first really was when he abandoned figurative art in the late 40s, which is another sort of complicated
because he had worked
story.
as doing WPA murals and so on up to that point out in the Midwest, right?
He had, and he did a monumental fresco with his friend Ruben Kadish in Morelia, Mexico, which if any of you get to the Tate in London while the current retrospective is up, there is a wonderful film that they have done and projected on the walls of the galleries in very large scale.
Of that mural.
Of what remains of that mural.
I was going to say, I thought it had been lost, right?
It's not totally lost.
Right.
There are parts of it that are largely intact, and we're doing what we can to try and get it properly conserved.
That's fantastic.
But cartoons have been in my father's mind, I think, from the very beginning.
Right.
He just didn't make the distinction between high art and low art. Right?
That's why he was the 11 o'clock of that.
It was the narrative, the ability to tell stories that ultimately disappointed him about abstraction.
Right.
Yep.
Even though he was an exquisite abstract painter, as I say, the conventional comparison was with Monet, wasn't it?
But he always rejected that. Yeah. I mean, if there was one subject that was never part of his work, it was the natural world.
Yes. Yeah, I understand that.
It was the inner landscape he wanted to.
He and nature were two in that.
Right, but so those incredible abstractions of the 50s and into the early 60s were really a reflection of him. He felt at the end of the 40s that the nature of his figurative work was too contrived, too flat. He wanted to go through a process that was spontaneous, that allowed for the expression of a sort of inner experience that hadn't come to him. In part, it was the frustration of not being able to express the agony of the Holocaust and all of that came up. He really felt the need to move inward, and it was that aspect, I think, of abstract expressionism that drew him in.
Yes, you
that each of these artists were in their own way sort of exploring an inner world.
in a state of a kind of existential process. You say in the
Yes.
book that he was always much more sympathetic. If we look at the two titans of art criticism of that period, that he was always closer to and more sympathetic with Harold Rosenberg
Oh, absolutely.
than with Clement Greenberg. That Rosenberg's idea of action painting, the idea that what all of those painters had in common was embodying their own inner struggle, was something that was sympathetic to him.
Right. And so you could say that, I mean, people are really struck with his return to the subject matter of his really early painting,
Yes.
early figurative
Right.
painting in his late work. There are
Right.
many examples
Echoes
of that.
and repeats.
So one way you can look at the whole sweep of his work is he found what to paint, then he found how to paint, and then he was able to put that together.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. I hope my daughter will say something equally shapely. Among those images, that run right through his work, let's jump into a controversial moment, were Klansmen, were hooded Klansmen. We find them in his early cartoons, in his social cartooning. They reappear as he's beginning to become a figurative painter again, and they run through. They're self-evidently, at least to my eye, they're sort of like the Inquisitors in Goya, or like
Yes.
that they're clearly kind of, if not horrific, they're kind of ghost-like figures. And he's fascinated, as you say at one point.
And comic figures.
Comic figures, yes, ridiculous figures. And he says, what were the Nazis like when they weren't being Nazis? And that's part of the intention. And yet, they've become a source of controversy in the last few years. Would you talk a little bit about the controversy, your response to it, and how you think we ought to react to it now?
Well, I think the controversy came about because the 4 museums that were intending to do the Guston retrospective, realizing that was a really key part of the work. And
that imagery was
that imagery,
right.
And it sort of initiated the late work. Mm-hmm. Because it was
a transition from the abstract work to the figurative work.
Yes. So there was fear with the 3 American museums, the National Gallery, the Houston, MFA Houston and MFA Boston, and Tate went along with their concern that the works would be misinterpreted as racist. Because, I really can't.
I can't explain what the argument would be,
but as many people have commented, they didn't really trust their viewers to make sense of what these works really were, which was, if anything, an interrogation of racism.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
At the most fundamental way, because they depict not the victims, but the victimizer,
Yeah.
So there was that, but
they're the monsters that the sleep of reason begets.
But I think the important context is really that it was a time when museums generally, especially in the United States, were under siege, when they were being questioned for the elitist institutions that they really were.
Legitimate inquiry
when they
of
were,
a kind. Yeah.
I mean, I was told by the director of the National Gallery that when she came on board, there were 47 people in their curatorial staff, and they were all white.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And their support staff, the guards and so on, were all black.
Yes.
This being Washington, D.C., which, probably stands as one of the more segregated
northern
cities.
southern city. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So somehow Guston became emblematic of the need that these institutions felt to remake themselves. And they got scared.
Right. And then there was a letter. Am I right about that?
Yes, the Brooklyn Rail published a letter of protest that ultimately was signed by a couple thousand people, including many well-known artists, including artists of color, and it became a big controversy. There was a whole lot of media coverage at that time. It was right in the first summer of COVID, in the summer of, well, this all came down around September 2020.
Yes.
So we were all quarantined then.
Yeah.
And it was sort of like the perfect cauldron that
Yes,
came to a boil
that-
with that. And I was up in Woodstock hiding out there in what was my parents' home, now our home, and the home of the Guston Foundation too. Although all our staff were sequestered in their homes. And watching this whole drama unfold and trying to make sense of it and trying to figure out how to respond to it, I didn't really have much of a public response. I refused most of the interview requests, which I'm really glad for, because I needed to work it through in my own mind and not just respond in an angry way or lash out at the institutions, because they were having their own struggles. And it's a long story with a lot of different ramifications.
Just bring us up to date. What's the state of it now?
Well, in response to this letter, the museums took their original delay of the show of 4 years and made it 2 years. And it's had, of course, I've seen all 4 versions of the show. It started out at MFA Boston, and there was a lot of effort to be very cautious and to put warnings around the imagery of the Klan figures and or the hoods. We call them hoods,
right?
Because it's more complicated, obviously, than the Ku Klux Klan. But and that engendered its own negative reaction from a lot of art world people who felt like they didn't need trigger warnings or messages from trauma specialists. You know,
any more than you would in a room full of Goyas, which are
exactly. So it was all very heated, and it didn't make a lot of sense to me. But I think my biggest struggle was thinking about how my father would have responded to this.
And how do you think he would have responded?
I think he would have withdrawn the show completely when this happened. Oh, absolutely. He would have felt that there was no chance of his work being appreciated in the complexity and depth that it had, that this sort of simplistic racial narrative was going to sort of make the response impossible. He would have been very upset. But my role as trustee of his legacy is quite a different one, of course. And there hadn't been a retrospective in 20 years, nearly 20 years. And I knew that there was a whole generation that basically had not had the opportunity to see the significant body of his work together in person. And I still very much wanted that to happen. And so I allowed that to happen and just followed with great concern and interest the different iterations that the curators had with it. And I have to say at this point, I'm very satisfied by it. I feel like my father's social conscience, let's put it that way, has been better understood by this show than by any previous exhibition. It's been limiting on one hand, but it's also what people most wanted.
Just
to see and to understand, and it's very much a function of the time that we're in, and it's spoken to people, and I think that's fine, because it's clear to me, having been to Guston shows my whole life and having seen every retrospective, that and you know, countless individual responses, many of them quite unique and unusual, that all of that is just fine. There is no right way to appreciate Philip Guston. The strength is that there are so many ways that you can appreciate the work, you know? So,
and what was that? It was John Cage said that beautiful thing that you try and banish everyone from the studio, and eventually you banish yourself, and the work just lives. Thank you for telling us that about that, because I know many people here were curious about that history and where it stood. Making a transition, both about your father would have just withdrawn. Your father became a very important kind of icon of a particular kind of artistic withdrawal in his later years, and we were talking before about his relationship with Philip Roth. Right. The great American novelist Philip Roth, because as you mentioned in the book, and Philip was a good friend, and as he said many times, the model for the character E.I. Lonoff in his great short novel The Ghostwriter was Philip Guston. And there was something, even though Philip Roth was much younger than Philip Guston, he saw something very potent about your father's deliberate withdrawal from the world. Talk a little bit about that, if you would, about his coming into, his closing down into his Woodstock studio.
In some ways, I mean, this is sort of a cruel thing to say, but his almost universal rejection by the art world after the Marlborough paintings of the hooded figures.
Right, this is the
in
1970.
That was the point at which my father, well, it was right after he had withdrawn from the New York art world. He gave up his studio in the city, his loft, and moved up to Woodstock full time. He was exhibiting the work that followed, but not selling it. To make a living, he taught at Boston University and was able to negotiate an agreement where he would go up once a month for 2 or 3 days, and have these intense experiences with his students there, many of whom have stayed in touch with me all these years and have vivid memories of those times with him. And the rest of the time he was in the studio, and he took great solace from the companionship, particularly of his poet friends and writer friends. Not so much painters, but
why painters? Because inevitably there'd be a competitive or
I don't know. I think
so.
Yeah. I think so. I mean, he was friendly with painters. I mean, he loved Bill de Kooning, I know that, and Mark Rothko. They were very close. He had a sort of long and contentious relationship with Jackson Pollock, who was a boyhood friend and fellow high school student in Los Angeles. So there were these relationships, but they weren't the kind of intimate. His friendships with writers were often with men, and they were mostly with men, a generation younger. And
like Roth or Rossfeld
or Clark Coolidge or Bill Bergson. I mean, these were the people that he wrote to and corresponded with.
There's a hilarious section in the book, which you must talk about briefly, between Philip Roth and Philip Guston about not picking up the telephone.
Right.
So
to sort of facilitate the quiet of Woodstock life and the studio, my father would turn off the telephone.
He would rig the phone so that the calls would go through, but the phone would never ring.
Exactly.
Right. So he didn't actually unplug it. It was still plugged in, but if you called, no one would pick up.
No one would pick up, and which I have no idea how he did that at
No,
that
I've
time.
never heard of that
This
arrangement.
is prior to more modern technology. You know, these were circular rotary phone, but so there. My father wrote this charming piece about the two Philips.
Yes.
About how, and Philip Roth finally saying in exasperation, "How can I get in touch with you? You won't pick up the phone."
He wrote him a letter saying, "Pick up the damn phone, and then we can carry on with our friendship."
Right, exactly.
Yes, it seemed like a beautifully perverse thing on your father's part,
Yeah.
because it wasn't just that he said, "I'm not available on the phone. You could call me, but I'll never pick up."
Right. Yeah.
It's a wonderful story, and it's beautifully kept in this book. That turn you mentioned it a second ago, right? In 1970, when he began to show the hoods, and then all of the painting that seems to us to be among the most profound and beautiful of in American art, was treated negatively. Was there anyone who supported him? The famous thing is Hilton Kramer's extremely negative and sneering review in the New York Times. I will always remember Robert Hughes, the late Robert Hughes, said once that about Kramer's eye for painting. He said that John Updike could get more aesthetic pressure out of a square inch of the pubic hair of a suburban housewife than Kramer could evoke from the entire works of Matisse.
Oh, that's a pretty good one. I like that.
Which I think was true and accurate. But
however, Robert Hughes
was a late
his review
right.
of the Marlborough show in 1970 was entitled Ku Klux Comics.
Yes, right.
And he basically concluded that the Klan was not a viable subject, not relevant anymore at that point in time. Oh, if he only knew.
Exactly.
And that
he came round,
and that my father's images were simple-minded.
Yes.
So he didn't get it. He really didn't get it.
No.
But he came around and admitted publicly, and eventually did a wonderful part of his American Visions series. He did a wonderful sequence in there in which he sort of got the elegiac nature of the late work.
Yes,
it took him a while, but he acknowledged it publicly, which it's not easy for a critic to do.
No, there's nothing harder than an art critic's apology, or usually more belated. But
Right.
but to his credit,
Right.
he did. But I was struck by in rereading this book that your father took that to heart. Took the rejection to heart. We like to imagine that artists are armored against, especially, that's why I mentioned Hughes on Kramer, against the opinion of obvious idiots of the kind art critics tend to be.
Yeah.
And yet it was genuinely harming and hurtful to him.
It was hurtful to him. It wasn't discouraging. I mean, it didn't take him away from the actual act of painting.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't make him doubt himself. I think there was so much sense of connection with what he was doing that nothing could erode that. But of course, artists want to be liked. They want to sell their work. They want to be able to support themselves. I have told myself, and this is sort of consoling statement, that, well, let's preface this by saying that 2/3 of the paintings he made in his life, he made in the last 12 years of his career.
Mm-hmm.
It was an incredibly prolific time. I believe that this would not have happened in the same way had the late work been embraced, because I think my father was very susceptible to, he loved to be with people. He loved social engagement. Mm-hmm. I think the discipline that it took to isolate himself was a really crucial factor, and that isolation was caused by this sense of rejection. Mm-hmm. And there were certain people, I mean, David McKee, his dealer all those years, from Marlboro times, actually, until his retirement in 2015, David and Renee McKee always believed in the
Believed in
work.
him totally.
And that was crucial.
And showed it regularly.
And showed it every year.
Yeah, every year, I recall, right.
And my father was always aware that young painters would come and just be fascinated by the work and respond to it. And that was the kind of recognition that he took real solace in, I think.
Yes, it showed a way for a whole generation of painters. It showed a way out of abstraction that wasn't reactionary, that didn't involve returning to something, but that pointed a way.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because people now sort of younger artists now don't understand what a rigid mentality surrounded abstract expressionism, or
what an exclusive mentality. Yeah.
Yeah, this idea that the next movement was supposed to be, I don't even keep track of the subsequent movements in art, but that there was one way one path that art should follow to be worthwhile.
Right. Purely optical and planar, and that was the we had achieved the New Jerusalem, and
because I think no one would argue now with the idea that my father was one of the principal influences that opened the door for people, for artists and younger painters and artists to pursue whatever it was that they felt driven to pursue.
In whatever vocabulary stirred and moved them most, whatever its origins.
So it was liberating.
Yes.
That and the fact that he had the courage to just do what he needed to do and what moved him, rather than what he was being praised for.
Right. Exactly. Talk, if you would, a little bit. One of the things that makes this, as I say, a moving and evergreen book is the novelistic side of it. By the way, you didn't mention who was the editor at Knopf, who you felt?
Vicki Wilson.
Vicki Wilson, a formidable.
Did you know her?
Oh, of course I knew
formidable,
her. Very formidable and very able editor.
I didn't really finish that story, but just to briefly say the aside. So she read my first draft, which I did over the summer of my final year, before my final year at Columbia, and Stephen Koch actually had brought me to Vicki, and she read it and she said, and I was under no illusion that I was getting read by a top editor at Knopf because of who my father was. It's sort of like perpetuating that whole story.
And not to interrupt music, but I mean the whole story of being your father's daughter, even as a writer.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, right.
Exactly. So she read it and she said, well, this is all very interesting, but you're not doing the real work of memoir. You're not understanding who your father was. This is sort of an adoring daughter story.
Right.
It's not very interesting. Why don't you find out who your father really was? And
that's very scary.
It's very scary. So it was not a matter of, going deeper into psychotherapy. It was more a matter of working as a biographer might, and actually going and interviewing.
Right.
And my great regret is that by the time I did that, most of my father's family was gone, his immediate siblings and so on. He was the youngest of 7.
Right.
So, it was the best advice, and it sort of forced me. What I found from all these interviews, I mean, I talked to Elaine de Kooning, who said they were all drunks. We were all drunks,
Yes. Right, including your father briefly.
Yeah,
but
not briefly.
It's an odd thing, isn't it, when we look back at those generations? They didn't think of themselves as drunks or alcoholics. They just were social drinkers. But we go back and look at it and we say, oh, my God,
Well, I think there was a romance associated with drinking.
Absolutely. But you had to go back and talk to people, to finish the story. And and you describe beautifully, at first they would be reticent. And then when they saw that you really wanted to know, they would open up about drinking, about
His
love
affairs
affairs and so on.
yes.
Was that difficult for you as a daughter to take
Well-
the role of biographer at that moment?
By that time, I have to be honest and say my ambition to be published by the top literary house in New York
Overwhelmed your
my-
loyalty to your dad's memory.
mean,
That's good to
you
know.
know.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ambition is
Yeah.
ambition.
Yes. Sound like your father. You were
Exactly.
your father's daughter, right?
Yeah. So, but I think it's that sort of willingness to push myself on that and not to make it a simple story of grievance that has led to the book continuing to be of interest.
I know we're running out of time, but one of the most, if you would talk a little bit about your mother, because one of the most
Yes.
moving things in the book is your description of her illness last year's, their relationship and so on. And that's such a, it comes from a period when the wife had
Yeah.
very stereotyped and
Right.
defined role.
And I struggled with that in my own sense of finding myself as a woman and as a wife and mother. My mother, and I wrote a whole chapter on that where I sort of described as I was writing, and a lot of this book was written in Woodstock at where my mother was living, and so she got to see parts of it.
Who shares her
and-
name, right?
Yeah, her name is Musa.
Too. That's
Also,
in itself.
Right. So I gained enormous respect for my mother. She was the sort of quintessential artist's wife, like the lioness at the gates, keeping the world away, but also being very clear that this was not her story, it was his. And actually, as we speak, I am about to embark on what I think will be my final Guston-related book, which I've just decided to do, which is to publish her journals
Oh, real? Huh.
of life with, it's probably going to be called Life with P, because in her journal she
She's
always
always P.
referred P, period, So
And
that's my
what's
next
the
project.
what's the chronology? What's the time span of the journals?
The journals are from 1966 when they were separated and he was living with another. Well, actually, I don't know that they were living together. That's a good question.
But he was involved with
He
another
was
woman.
very seriously involved with another woman who went on to become Motherwell's wife, actually.
Huh.
Renata Ponsel,
Right, right.
her name was. And it's from that period through 1976. She had a serious stroke that interfered
Right.
with her word-finding abilities after that.
Right.
And she never really wrote. She continually edited her work, but she didn't compose anything.
And
after
it's one of
that.
the wrenching things in the book is you had to console your father about
My mother's stroke.
Your
yeah.
mother's stroke, yeah.
Yeah, he was completely lost during that period. Yeah, she was such a quiet presence in his life that I don't think anybody understood how crucial she was for him.
How much he depended on her
Oh, absolutely.
in that way. Well, it's a moving part of the book. I know we're running out of time, but just
Yeah.
let me ask you finally, Musa, what's your, as you've been going around the world, you're just telling me you were in London for the show. What do you see in your father's painting now, and Philip Guston's painting now, that wasn't visible to you as a girl growing up?
Oh, everything, really. I mean, I think the reason I wrote Night Studio was to discover who he was, not just from his friends and the people who knew him, but to understand the whole scope of his 50 years of work and to sort of explore it in depth, to read what others had written about it, to go and see all the different I mean, it's been fascinating to see what different curators do with the work,
Right.
the story that they want to tell about Guston.
A story of social consciousness, or a story of narrative painting,
Or a story just of the aesthetic experience of the work itself. So since I've spent so much time, I mean, it's been 43 years since he died now.
Is it that long? Really? Yeah.
It is. And 35 years since I wrote Night Studio. So a lot of that time, particularly in recent years, has been spent with the work, looking at it, working with the staff of the Guston Foundation to sort of bring together all of the materials that go into making catalog raisonné and so on.
Right.
So I'm probably more dispassionate, more removed from it now, but the enthusiasm is still there. I mean, the pleasure of seeing these retrospectives, they're different iterations, particularly the one in Washington, which was so wonderful.
Why specifically the one in
Because
Washington?
it was the most extensive by far, and because of the spaces and the lighting and a lot of little details went into making it really the best Guston show I've ever seen.
Well, for me, one of the marks of a truly great painter is that their work looks equally good at every distance. In other words, when you're up close to the surface, when you're a foot away, or
Right.
when you're
Right.
100 feet away. It looks equally interesting, and that's true of your father's painting.
Absolutely.
In ways that are, you have to include Cézanne and
Right.
and
I've had the pleasure of doing something I had never done before since Hauser Wirth has been representing my father's work, and that is actually curating shows myself, writing catalogs,
yes, and
essays,
yes,
and so on.
And we don't need another art critic, Musa, right? We've got enough of them.
It's true. It's true.
I'm teasing you. If your father were with us now, he would be A, pleased to be remembered, B, hugely dissatisfied with everything he was unhappy with in his work, or somewhere between.
It was not really in his nature ever to be satisfied,
Right.
but I think there's something that he says. I don't know if you've ever seen the wonderful Michael Blackwood film, the hour-length film. And he's being asked, this is just a few weeks before he died, how would he like to be remembered? And he says something like, I'd like to be in the same place where Cézanne was and all the greats, I forget exactly who he mentions, and have them pat me on the back and say, pas mal, sonny. Not bad.
Pas mal, pas mal. That's a beautiful story. Musa Mayer, thank you so much for joining us.
Adam.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pas mal.